Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We took a little short summer break, but we are back, and as we reconvene today, the climate question. Most people say, look, it's just time to get on with this low carbon world. Might be a question of timing, 2030 versus 2050 in terms of Canada, but we just need to start moving. But the resource sector is still feeling pretty much under attack. And by resource sector, I don't just mean oil and gas. I mean agriculture and forestry and mineral extraction and the whole nine yards. And they are facing new taxes and new production and emissions caps and unrealistic timelines and regulatory hell. So they say that's killing productivity and prosperities. So let's take a look at the state of our energy nation with Gary Marr. He is the president and CEO of the Canada West Foundation, professor of business at the University of Alberta. He was a cabinet minister and a member of the Alberta legislature for some 15 years. He and I knew each other, but we really crossed paths when he was sent to Washington as Alberta's ambassador to the United States to talk about cross-border issues. And he is very, very familiar with that. So Gary, welcome, and we'll come back to the whole state of play in the United States of America a little bit later on. But I really want to begin with your assessment as you put that hat back on of sort of ambassador. There was your province sending an ambassador to Washington. Now you've got one. Excellent. And that would work, and they would love that. I can almost see your face now, but not really. For those of you that aren't watching, he's just put on his stampede hat, his cowboy hat, looking good. But now Alberta feels like it has needed to set up an office and send an ambassador to Ottawa. What is the state of the relationship?
Look, if we're talking about the relationship between Alberta and the federal government, I mean, there's always been a dynamic between, going back to the time of Peter Lougheed,
Yep.
of, sort of campaigning against the federal government in favor of things that supported our constitutional responsibilities. And I think the current premier is doing a good job of saying to the federal government, stay in your lane. I have a general theory that governments can accomplish more if they do less. So in the case of the federal government, if they would stay out of daycare, stay out of pharmacare, stay out of things like, school food programs, where they don't have any A, jurisdiction, and B,
Right.
they don't have the mechanisms to be able to actually deliver on something, then maybe something that they do have responsibility for, like putting clean water on First Nations reserve, would actually be accomplished by now, or that we'd be able to do something with our military, that we'd be able to defend ourselves in the Arctic, and that we'd be able to, find people for the 16,000 the Canadian Armed Forces is looking for. So, in my view, the Canadian government gets involved in a lot of things that are really provincial jurisdictions.
Yeah.
And they could accomplish more if they had a shorter agenda of focusing on the things that are actually important to a federal government.
And they've had their wings clipped a little bit in the Supreme Court on the environmental impact assessment bill, or Bill 69. There'll never be another pipeline bill, as it's called, a federal court ruling on single-use plastics, etc. And then the provinces, actually, with the Alberta Sovereignty Act and Saskatchewan with the Saskatchewan First Act, saying, okay, look, we need to remember where those lines of jurisdiction and distinction are and play by those rules. Do you think it's had an impact on Ottawa? Have you seen a change?
Well, saying that you're going to do something is different than doing
Right.
what you say. So, I'm of the view that, words are cold, but deeds are hot. So I'd like to see more deeds in this respect of the federal government actually coming to the understanding that provinces, so there are some issues that require collaboration between a federal and provincial government. But provinces are not merely stakeholders, they are partners. And so just checking off the box to say, yeah, we've talked to you, but then deciding, what the end result is, that's not real collaboration. That's
Yeah,
not
if
real
you talk and don't listen, it doesn't really work.
right. Exactly right. And the way the federal government operates is, I mean, you're from Saskatchewan, so you would
Yeah.
get this metaphor. It's as if they've got the hammer in every end of the match, right? So, to me, it can work. Cooperation can work. And an example would be a couple of years ago, ministers of agriculture all got together and they agreed on a strategic agricultural policy that everybody signed on for. And then it wasn't 2 weeks later, maybe less, when it's announced that they want a voluntary 30% reduction in the use of fertilizer.
Yeah.
That is not being a good partner. That's not being impeccable with your word. That's not doing what you say you're going to do. So these are
Well,
challenges.
it's also kind of completely counterproductive at a time when we know energy and agriculture fuel this economy in so many different respects, and where because of situations like Ukraine, the world is facing, potential food shortages, etc. And why would you make a move like that? Like sometimes it just this is all under the guise of the climate and concern for the environment, but people have common sense and go, if we need food, maybe this is not the day we should be doing this, or maybe we should moderate it a bit.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that, if you were to, ask, what do you think Canada is most interested in doing as a government? They'd say, well, maybe their mission is to try and make their nationally determined commitments under the Paris Accord, which for most Canadians doesn't really mean anything. But if
Right.
you were to ask instead, what role should Canada play in the world? You might say, we should be trying to make the world safer, more secure, and more verdant. So, you know, providing energy security is part of making the world safer. Providing food security. I mean, Canada is one of only a handful of countries in the world that produces much more food than it consumes. And
Right.
so, can we provide a role in doing that? Can we provide a way of making the world more verdant? Well, part of that is providing natural gas to displace the use of coal in parts of the world that are high emitters. And I was just talking to Premier Higgs this morning, and he was
Yeah.
talking about wanting to move natural gas, out of a facility that's owned by Repsol in New Brunswick. So to me, making the world more peaceful, making it safer, more secure, and greener, that sounds like a Canadian hat trick, and that's what we really ought to be striving for.
Yeah, I think that's where the disconnect is, when Germany and some of our European allies say, look, we could use some LNG here to replace the dictator oil and all of the things that come from Russia. And we go no, because that conflicts with our environmental policies or desires. Then people go, yeah, but this is kind of a different situation. I'm just getting the sense, and I know some of the pollsters are feeling it too, and it's partly because of just the affordability crunch and inflation and those things too. People are going, look, we care about the environment. Don't mishear us or misunderstand, but we got to do it at a pace and a rate that we can afford. We can't just write a blank check.
Well, that speaks to what you said earlier, is that Canadians are pretty common sense. I mean, I would never discount the wisdom of Canadians overall to understand that, yes, we want to do something that's right by the environment, but we have to do it at a pace that makes sense for us, that we cannot take all measures at the cost of our economy, that, there has to be really three E's: the economy, energy, and the environment. And 30 years ago, those policy spheres didn't really overlap. Well, today they do overlap.
Yeah.
And so, are there things that we can do that is in a Venn diagram way, a common denominator, so that we can, walk and chew gum at the same time? The answer is yes. can we develop our energy responsibly? Can we move it responsibly? The answer is yes. And does the world want it? As you point out, Chancellor Scholz is here. Prime Minister Kishida of Japan was here. You've had the Polish president say, we want natural gas from Canada. And the answer has been, well, no. And you've had a prime minister that said there's no business case for it. And I would argue it's actually not the prime minister's job. It's the job of the private sector to decide. We understand the risks, we understand the market. Let the private sector decide, allow our regulatory regime in Canada to be in such a way that we can make safe decisions about the responsible use of energy, and let the private sector decide whether we're going to move forward on it.
Just give me your sense in the world, because the Prime Minister's plan, or Ottawa's plan, has always been sort of focused on 2030 or maybe 2035 on, depending on whether they're talking about EVs or carbon emissions or whatever. And Alberta and the industry are basically saying 2050 is a realistic goal. We can do it by then. What's really going on there? Are they just trying to wait out the current government and then maybe have a little bit more flexibility? What's realistic? Should we just agree on 2040 and say, let's split the difference and aim for that?
In a sense, it's an arbitrary date, right?
Correct. Yeah.
But I mean, Premier Moe of Saskatchewan, Premier Smith, if you listen to Pathways, the Pathways Alliance, which represents 5 of the 6 major oil sands producers, and they'll say, 2050 is realistic. Now, but it comes at a cost. And so there's really sort of 3 things that we talk about. One is, what's the technology say? So carbon capture and storage, it works. Boundary Dam in Saskatchewan proves that. So technology, yeah, it works. So, if we're to grade it, maybe it's a B. Public policy is something that you need, but it's kind of a bit all over the map. So public policy, maybe a C or a C minus. Financing, the financing will follow if you get the public policy right. So how do you finance these projects? That's an issue. But the big one that nobody really talks about is, does the Canadian public agree with this direction? Do they want to see electricity go from, I don't know, here in Calgary, it's probably 15 cents a kilowatt hour. Are you prepared to go to 60 or 80 cents a kilowatt hour? Nobody's really asking Canadians, what do you think of the cost of this? What do you think of the idea that by the federal government's plans, you're not going to be able to buy an internal combustion engine after 2035? Where are all the electrons going to come from?
Right.
British Columbia, Site C, there's no Site D, E, or F that you're going to be able to do. So where's the electricity going to come from to electrify your economy? So both in Manitoba and in British Columbia, they're now net importers of electricity, not net exporters of electricity. British Columbia, through BC Hydro, used to make a lot of money selling electrons to the state of California. They have to import now because they've kind of used up all of their hydroelectric resources, for electricity within the province of British Columbia.
And we're not so lucky in Alberta and Saskatchewan in terms of hydroelectricity. It's easier to have this discussion in Quebec and Ontario and even until, as you say, recently BC, but it's different for us.
It is different, and this is the piece that I think needs to be recognized in the energy picture, is that we often talk about the strength of our country being the diversity of people. Well, the strength of our country is also in part the diversity of our resources, and the kinds of resources available in Alberta and Saskatchewan are very different from Atlantic Canada or British Columbia or the Belle Province or Ontario. And so I think we need to recognize that the solutions are not, equally applicable all across the country. So
yeah, that's part of the problem with a federal one-size-fits-all approach, And
Right.
especially then when they undermine their own argument by saying there'll be some carve outs for the East Coast, but not for the West Coast. You can't argue those things at the same time.
Well, it is a bit like sucking and blowing at the same time. It's
Yeah.
not possible. And so the idea that we want to move to a greener, more verdant economy, I think this is a good thing. This is something that Canadians can agree on.
Yeah.
But the how you do it, we have to figure out, do people agree with the object? I think generally speaking, yes. But the how you do it is really critically important, that you cannot dictate it from a single perspective
Yeah.
when nature of your resources is so different across Canada.
Well, and I think we do have to have a pretty honest conversation about costs, because you hear federal cabinet ministers sort of imply that your standard of living is going to have to drop. You're not going to be able to keep your homes as warm or as cool in the summer, and you're going to have to take the bus. You're not, and they kind of do that without sort of saying what where do we have consensus on those things? Taking public transit works in Toronto. Sorry, Wadena, Saskatchewan, not so much, right? So everybody has to be involved in that so it's realistic.
Yeah, and this is a real issue, is that Canadians aren't being engaged in this conversation in a particularly deep way. You've got farmers in places like the Netherlands who have come out strongly against
Mm-hmm.
some of their provisions, the government's provisions on dealing with the climate. It wouldn't be hard to see how Canadians might be might be motivated to the same kind of pushback on some
Yeah.
of the plans going forward.
I had an interesting conversation the other night, one of my neighbors here at Fishing Lake, and a conversation about the use of ethanol, right? Which is, again, one of these things. This is a plant-based oil product, et cetera. It's supposed to be safer for the environment. The percentage in at the pumps is higher than it should be. The vehicles aren't ready. It's damaging farm equipment because people aren't there, and nobody is talking about it or doing anything about it or regulating it or changing it. And you're not fooling any farmer who understands why his piece of equipment has ground to a halt, right? They understand these issues, and so you can't treat them as if, oh, well, this is good for the environment, so never mind what this is costing you.
Well, I mean, there is a certain audience that will say, well, if it's for the environment, I'm all for it. But our recent forest fires in
Mhm.
Jasper National Park demonstrate that sometimes what is popular public policy is not good, and what is good public policy is not always popular. So back in the 1990s, the province of British Columbia, their forest scientists were saying, when the mountain pine beetle first emerged, they were saying you gotta burn the forest. You gotta burn it. You gotta kill these things before it spreads to healthy forests. They didn't do that because the idea of cutting down trees in a provincial park or in a federal park were just not popular with the public. So then the second part is, now you've allowed the mountain pine beetle to express itself all over our forests. You've got about 10 years. You can still cut down the tree and get dimensional lumber out of it. It's tinted. It's a blue tinted piece of 2x4,
Huh.
but you can still do it. But they didn't do that either. And the result is that we ended up with these dry, dead forests, like a giant carbon bomb waiting to go off. So in 2023, the largest emitter of CO2 into the atmosphere from Canada came from forest fires. Nothing else was a close second. And so it wasn't popular public policy to say, we got to cut down trees in national parks. We've got to thin it out. We've got to get rid of deadfall. We've got to take the
Yeah.
tinderbox out of it. But government succumbed to what was publicly popular instead of what was actually the right thing to do. This is one
and
of the
and the environmentally sensible thing to do, because this is the shorthand that you hear on the newscasts and hear in conversation, which is, oh, it's climate change causing forest fires. No, it was kind of bad policy, as you say, causing forest fires.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't doubt that climate change is a contributor, but if it was solely climate change, then we would expect, beetle infestations and wildfires in places like Sweden and Finland. Well, they don't. They don't have the same kind of problem because they actually manage their forests in such a way, and they've done so for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And even First Nations here in Canada, they regularly burn the forests, and they allow the underbrush to come out, new growth comes out, animals come in to eat the new shoots that come up. And this has actually been very, very good practice expressed by our First Nations for thousands of years here in Canada. We could learn a lesson or two from that.
Yeah, no kidding. Let's just do a bit of a checklist here, just to see where we're at on a couple of the key items. So oil is still Canada's largest export, about 5 million barrels a day is what I read. That is up 30% in the last decade. So that would suggest that that there is still a demand and a need, and that that's not likely going to change tomorrow morning.
Almost all of our oil goes to one marketplace, and that's the U.S. And when I got to Washington in 2006, the amount of foreign oil that came into the United States, Alberta made up maybe 11% of their imports. Today, Canada collectively, it's well over 50%. And so, it's going through by pipeline and by rail to refineries in the United States. But I would not talk about that, with our U.S. partners, because, they develop their own oil, and you want to say to them, look, we're displacing your oil with our oil. Instead, our language should be, we export jobs to the United States in a pipeline, because the refinery in Lima, Ohio, and I've been there, the refinery in the refinery in Detroit, the Marathon refinery, I've been there. I've been to the refinery in, Suncor's refinery in Colorado. I've been there. And we create jobs in the United States because we export the crude oil to them. They refine it, they upgrade it, and in some cases they sell it, whether it's our natural gas or whether it's our oil, they sell it to markets abroad. So that is a good relationship for us to enjoy, as long as we're not able to export those finished goods ourselves. Which leads me to the issue of the upcoming review of the USMCA or Canada-US Mexico Free Trade Agreement, depending on what side of the border you're on. It comes up for review in early 2026.
Right.
So we need to think as Canadians about what we're going to do on that, because you signed the agreement with Donald Trump, and then Senator Kamala Harris voted against it when she was a U.S. Senator. So Canadians are going to have to figure out, well, how are we going to thread this needle to make sure that our largest trading partner still wants to do business with us.
And Joe Biden killed Keystone like day one.
Yeah, he did. And so, I mean, you chat with people, they say, well, maybe we need to demonstrate that we are good partners in something other than trade. And so whether it's been Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump, they're looking for Canada to spend 2% of its GDP on making its NATO commitments. Our allies are looking for the same thing. The challenge is that the system is broken. You can spend that money, but I'm not sure that you can absorb that money wisely when you don't have the 16,000 people you need for a full complement of Canadian military. When you've got a procurement system that is utterly broken, you've got to fix those things before you move forward. And the idea that we're going to just dump it all into submarines, a hastily put together press release at the
back of an envelope.
Probably not a good idea. So should we move towards a military that has capability to, stand on guard for the true north, strong and free? The answer is yes. but we can't do it all in one fell swoop. We've got to make sure that we fix the system first, then it can absorb the money and be spent wisely instead of on whatever the latest shiny whistle is.
Yeah, I mean, we just had a conversation on the pod with Wayne Eyre, good Saskatchewan boy, outgoing CDS, but, talking about those very issues, 16,000 people short in the military, and white paper after white paper after white paper on what we should do when it's as obvious as the nose on our face. What we could do for ourselves and for our allies is defend the North. We have nothing there. The Russians go into our airspace whenever they feel like it. The Chinese are there regularly and constantly mapping new sea routes. Like we claim sovereignty, but we don't even have a presence.
Well, and that, the military is the largest discretionary budget item in the federal government's budget. And I think it needs to be recognized by Canadians that our sovereignty, it's not good enough to be surrounded by three large oceans and the largest undefended border in the world.
Right.
That we can't do all things as a military, but defending our own sovereign interests is one thing that we have to do. And when you talked about the Chinese or the Russians floating around in the Arctic, I think Canadians need to come to the realization that we are a frontline state.
Exactly.
To be these potential challenges to our own sovereignty and to the United States, and we could do a lot of allaying the concerns of the United States if we did the right things in terms of being able to monitor, detect, and deal with issues in the high Arctic, but also on cybersecurity.
And kind of take that to the table when we're trying to figure out how we negotiate the next trade agreement, if there is to be one. The Democrats are every bit as protectionist as any version of Donald Trump will be. It is the nature of the relationship with the U.S. As I said, they stopped Keystone. They kind of cut our grass with the Inflation Reduction Act. And sort of really jumping ahead on some of the green projects. Although, interestingly, I read this week that 40% of the IRA projects are delayed or paused indefinitely. So they're not having as good success with these green projects either. Right. There's lots of issues. What's your take on that?
Well, let me say, first of all, the Inflation Reduction Act is the most cleverly named piece of legislation that has nothing to do with inflation. But I would say this, generally speaking, I've never been a fan of industrial policy, but make no doubt about it, industrial policy is here to stay. And the IRA is yet one of many examples, and not just in the United States, it's happening in other parts of the world as well.
Correct. Yeah.
So, we need to come up with the ideas that for industrial policy that makes sense for us. Now, with transformation always comes risk, but there's also risk that comes from doing nothing. Would I have put $40 billion into electric battery plants? Maybe not. But are there things that we should be doing that can that makes sense for taking what are our current assets and making sure that they are done in the best possible way? Can we be an energy superpower in the country? The answer is yes, we can. And can we be a super provider of food in the world? Yes, we can. And these are the kinds of ambitions that we ought to have that would be consistent with any industrial policy.
But not by funding EV plants in which all the intellectual property goes back to South Korea or some other country, right. And right. They bring over their people to do the jobs. Like this makes no sense.
Well, so here's an interesting factoid. The University of Alberta has a world-leading AI center at the University of Alberta. We are leaders in this area, but we are laggards in the world when it comes to commercialization of that technology. And so to me, if you've got resident clever sausages at the University of Alberta. You should take advantage of it. There is your competitive advantage. If you wanted to have an industrial policy, as everybody's talking about AI, but yeah, okay, that's a great idea. We've actually got the human capital to make that work. That seems to me to be a much better idea in terms of an industrial policy.
One of the issues, just because you've raised it, I think I want to go down that road, but with AI, and again, we all get, excited about new technology and wow, and isn't it great? And it's got its downsides in terms of, creating new sources of misinformation, but it's going to revolutionize the workplace. But it also takes a whole lot of electricity. And then it brings us back to that whole issue about how do we generate it, where do we get it, and at what cost?
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point. I mean, if you look at the amount of energy consumed by a data center or by doing an AI search, I think people would be shocked. I think Greta Thunberg would be shocked at how much electricity it takes, to do a search of Greta Thunberg's work. That's the great irony.
Yes.
So I couldn't agree with you more that to me, at the core of an economy is affordable, reliable energy. You cannot develop any kind of economy with affordable, reliable energy. Now, the great news is we got lots of energy in this country, including, as you know, from your province, Premier Moe is always talking about small modular nuclear. I think this is a very good idea to move forward on such things in a way that's responsible. I'm not saying that we don't need regulations to do it, but surely if other countries in the world have figured it out, so can we.
No, I mean, and there's still a debate over that. And it's the same with other parts of this. I mean, wind and solar, like everybody champions these, and I'm sure it's all at some point going to be a much bigger part of the answer to the problem, but it's not now. Like wind, it's kind of 7% maybe as long as the wind blows, solar less than 1% of our needs. Again, because of the capture, how do we store it? How do we capture it? All of that. Most of our electricity still generated by fossil fuels. So like we have a long way to go here.
Well, if you look at, sort of projections of people like Daniel Yergin or the International Energy Agency or the U.S. Department of Energy Information Administration, you'll find that fossil fuels will continue to be consumed, well into this century. And in particular, in places like China, where like, the last number that I saw was that in 2022, they approved over 160 coal-fired power plants in China. Yep. So, I mean,
and we're still exporting coal to them, I believe.
Indeed, it is the largest mercantile export of the province of British Columbia. Is thermal coal coming out of British Columbia going to China.
So that's again where the public kind of goes, okay, here's the world contribution to emissions, and you've got China up here, and you've got US close behind, and then you've got Canada, and that we're proposing some pretty tough, some say draconian measures when the problem is somewhere else and that our contribution is small. And if we maybe thought about not supplying China with coal, or if we, provided our LNG or our relatively clean oil and gas to the world, that would be a good contribution.
It would, for as long as the world is going to consume these things. I think it makes sense for Canada to be there because we do develop it responsibly. And I'll say this, I mean, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of rocks. The Stone Age ended because a better technology displaced it. Similarly, the age of fossil fuels will not end because we run out of oil and gas. It'll end because someday, we don't know when exactly, there will be a technology that displaces it. But it's a technology that is not yet there. The answer is not in wind turbines and solar panels. It can provide supplementary energy to us, but it cannot replace the base load that is found in fossil fuels. I mean, it's hard to change the laws of thermodynamics.
Let me just come back to the where we are on the oil and gas and some of these other issues. It was, and it's not just Western Canada either. I mean, Newfoundland has more oil than Norway, right? We've got lots of energy provinces in this country. And the dependence of Ottawa for a lot of the programs that it wants to talk about, whether they're inside their jurisdiction or out, that comes from the revenue from oil and gas and this energy that they disparage. I don't know even if they understand their dependency on the revenue generated by an industry they're radically trying to change in a very compressed time.
You mentioned Norway. It would be a good idea for us to look at what they're doing in Norway, which is developing a lot of oil and gas.
Yeah.
And nobody seems to, in Norway, seems to be all that concerned about such developments. And yes, Statoil Hydro, as it was once called, was also involved in hydro and other wind energy and such. But they are big developers of oil and gas. And so it seems to me that they have come to an understanding as a society, as a nation, that this is the business that we're in. We're going to do it responsibly. Canadians should come to the same realization and understanding that we are a nation that depends upon oil and gas. That is part of what has made us have a great standard of living. And we need to continue to find ways to decarbonize our economy and decarbonize the use of fossil fuels. That would be a good thing, but we shouldn't stop it because what would that do to creating the opportunities for the Russian Federation or other nations in the world that don't care about the responsible development of energy?
A question about carbon capture, which sure seems to work in bigger projects, but you've also got environmentalists, even the former minister, Catherine McKenna, saying this is just more greenwashing, that it doesn't really work in any way for, just ordinary consumers and city life and country life, that it may kind of work on a site of a big operation. What's your take on carbon capture?
It's expensive. The technology is getting better, but it is expensive. And I'd say this, so the technology works, but you got to be able to do it at scale in a way that it takes advantage of the geology that allows you to store the carbon, or industrial processes that store the carbon. So you've got the Heidelberg cement plant in Edmonton that is taking CO2 and they're going to put it in their concrete. And that is going to lock that CO2 in there forever. If you look at, the geology of Alberta, taking industrial CO2 emissions and putting them in a carbon trunk line, as Wolf Midstream has done here in Alberta, so that you can move it to the place where you can store it in a place that's got reservoir rock that can take CO2 and store it forever. That's a good thing. So does it work all across Canada? It does not work all across Canada. So Minister McKenna would be correct in the sense that, you're not finding places to store CO2 in the province of Ontario because it's Canadian Shield. That's very different than the geology of Saskatchewan and Alberta, as an example.
Let me just say TMX. Let's take your take on the pipeline. The government, I think, surprised many when they put the money into it, a big chunk of it. Was it worth it? Is it doing what it needs to do when it doesn't really go south in that direct way?
So the answer is yes. I think that this pipeline, even at its inflated cost, was worth it. And people ask, how did a $6 billion project become a $34 billion project? There were lots of reasons. I mean, there was atmospheric rivers in British Columbia that washed out, the Trans-Canada Highway. And the people who were working on TMX, They were deployed to fix the highway. That was a
Right.
national emergency. You had COVID that was going on. You had, I don't know, hundreds of archaeological sites and thousands of artifacts that they discovered. So I wouldn't think of it as being equivalent to the way that the original Trans Mountain Pipeline was built, which was 70 years ago, at a time when Vancouver had like 450,000 people, and there was a big cow
Right.
pasture between Calgary and Edmonton 70 years ago. I would look at the pipeline as being not a single project, but maybe even hundreds of little projects. The engineering marvel that it is a remarkable one. And the Bank of Canada estimated that the impact in Q2 of 2024 upon the completion of this was 0.25% of the GDP. Now, when you're thinking about
That's huge.
2.25% of $2.9 trillion, this is a material impact. And next year, we're going to have LNG Canada come on stream, and it's going to have a material impact as well. And the billions of dollars every year that are generated for governments federally and provincially as a result of TMX, and what ultimately will be the case with LNG Canada, are really important for the growth of our economy, because right now our productivity per capita is not very good.
Right.
And projects like this, we need a dozen more projects like this.
Yeah,
Not
it's a huge issue in our I
huge.
mean, the productivity. This is, we can talk about provincial trade barriers and all the rest of it, but we just don't have the investment and the activity we need to generate the dollars and cents on a per capita basis, GDP. Yeah.
Professor Trevor Toombs of the University of Calgary did
Yeah.
this piece where he looked at the GDP per capita of 50 US states and 10 Canadian provinces. There's only one jurisdiction that was in the top 15 from Canada. Places like Ontario were ranked in the 50s
Yeah.
alongside places like Alabama. I mean,
Yeah.
that should be alarming to anybody.
It absolutely should be. Yeah.
Our standard of living depends on being able to improve our GDP. And I should say that doesn't mean that people have to be working more for the same amount of money. What it means is we need to be working smarter. We need to
Yeah.
be more productive with the labor and capital that we employ, and that a lot more money has to be put in by the private sector in areas like, research and development.
The other question that's out there that we has taken, the better part of 10 years, but this just transition, and the fact that not everybody that works in the current oil and gas sector of whatever version is going to become a coder or a rocket scientist tomorrow. And a lot of jobs are on the line, and now it's pushed out again to 25, 26. Is that a reasonable timeline, given that the rest of the activity seems to have slowed a little bit too? Or is this just, words, and people are going to be that are put out of work are going to be trying to find a job somewhere else, and that's it? It's not going to be Ottawa with a just transition sustainable jobs program that solves that problem.
Well, maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but I think about the closure of the cod stock fisheries off the coast of
Yep.
Newfoundland and the devastating impact that it had on Newfoundlanders. And Rex Murphy wrote passionately about how the energy sector was a savior for people that came from Newfoundland and Labrador.
Yep, for
And
sure.
to me, there is no savior if the energy sector goes down. There's no place where you've got roughly 600,000 people that are involved in the oil and gas and upstream oil and gas activities. I don't know where you place 600,000 people anywhere in the country, but it won't work. And so the idea of a just transition, I think there's something probably to learn from what they did in the UK with their transition with Scotland. And that is where industry was really treated like a partner and not just a stakeholder to be met with and checked off in a box. Governments, both the government of Scotland and the UK government and industry were all together as partners to sort of map out how that was going to work. And so, it's another example where saying so won't
Yeah.
make it so. You've
Doesn't
actually
make
got to do
it. Well,
something.
and as we've seen, as we're watching today in the housing sector and the the bankruptcies that are occurring, et cetera, you can't have an immigration policy or random immigration and then be surprised that it's impacting healthcare and housing and the job market, right? Like these things, the dots need to be connected before the fact, not after.
Well, on that subject, I mean, we've just put out an opinion piece in the Hub on what you need to build 3 or 4 million houses by the end of the decade. And
Right.
what it means is you need north of 300,000 people to work in housing
Right.
construction. Where are you going to get those people from? How are you going to train them?
Yeah.
And I think the federal government has focused a lot on sort of the training of Red Seal union members, but 90% of the people who work on housing are not Red Seal. The exceptions
Right.
are electricians and plumbers.
Right.
But
Right.
other than
Right.
that, 90% of them are not unionized and they're not Red Seal apprentices. So you've got to be able to figure out how to make this opportunity work by training them so that people can make good money and have good jobs working in the construction sector.
Right. So figuring how to do that with people that might be in the oil and gas industry now at the same time as they're competing with all the new immigrants, that doesn't bode well either.
No, it does not.
Yeah. Okay, I want to just come back a little bit to where we are on the cost of doing business. So we've got new EV mandates. We've got clean fuel taxes, new clean fuel tax on top of carbon taxes. We've got new clean electricity regulations. We've got new caps on oil and gas emissions. I think I heard the other day in an interview that there are something like 400 regulations that must be met on a particular carbon capture project that's underway in Alberta. So, and government is increasingly kind of regulating around the court rulings that they're losing as well. So that kind of means more regulation. What is the impact? And no sign that the government is going to back away any further from carbon taxes and the predicted increases that will come. What is the impact of that? Is that what's slowing things down?
So maybe I'm saying something that might be a little controversial, but I like regulations. And I think business likes
Yeah.
regulations
Predictability.
as long as it's predictable and
Yeah.
good regulations. And so, when I talk to sort of ordinary folks and I talk about Bill C-69, which you know a lot about, the permitting of activities under the Impact Assessment Act,
Right.
I say, look, imagine that you are building a deck in your house. You understand why you need to get a permit to build your deck, and you
Right.
understand why you need to have your neighbors agree with it. But imagine a permitting process that is not a permitting process that is a non-political one, that the mayor actually has to provide the say so, and that you don't have to invite just the people in your neighborhood, but
Yeah.
people in Regina are going to have
Yeah.
a comment on what your
Everybody across town, come on in.
everybody, yeah, all y'all come, right? And so that in such a circumstance, it would cost you thousands of dollars to go through this process,
Yeah.
and at the end of the day, the mayor might say, you know what, I'm getting too much pressure from the non-deck people across the country because you haven't gotten your 2x4s,
Right.
your decking material from sustainably, grown forest. And
Right.
so I'm not doing it. And that kind of regulation is bad. It leads to uncertainty and it leads to a chilling effect on regulations. And I think that regulations, if properly constructed, are good because it leads to certainty. But bad regulations don't result in better decks being made. It results
Right.
in no decks being made.
Yeah. And you also have parallel processes of you've got to meet all the provincial regulations and then the federal regulations, and then they go to court and then they change. And you can sort of see why some of the industry members are kind of standing back and saying, when you guys settle all of this, give us a call and we'll maybe proceed, right?
Right.
So one final topic I just want to raise with you, and it kind of comes back to the AI and what these things cost. And there was a good announcement in Saskatchewan on rare minerals, and we've got a lot of the what's necessary. China has more, obviously, but these things come at a great cost. The development of these minerals, it's not a clean business. And the demand is growing because every cell phone and every computer and everything needs all of these minerals. That's not going to stop. That is going to increase. Can we develop those and extract those minerals in a clean way? Or are we at least trying to get ahead of the game on that front instead of trying to play catch up?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I've got a good answer for you. I do concern myself with whether the rush to develop rare earth minerals actually displaces one environmental issue with another environmental issue.
Exactly.
But I don't know what the answer is. I know that, people in the mining business talk about the practices in Canada and they compare it with other jurisdictions. So I think generally speaking, we are more responsible. But it is, we shouldn't give it a pass either in terms of the environmental impact.
And if we're going to continue the demand in this is the thing, the EV, the vehicles are supposed to be the answer, but they create this demand. I mean, we don't know what we're going to do with the batteries. The batteries are not that, the ones that the government has just subsidized are probably out of date already in terms of where the technology is going. So the balancing act between what we think is green and what appears green versus the actual cost of making it green.
Well, there's the rub. The good public policy lesson for today is that, and I repeat myself when I say good public policy isn't always popular, and what's popular isn't always good public policy. I think that public policy that is developed in the fullness of time, you can come up with the right answers, or maybe in some cases the least bad answers.
Yeah.
Public policy is not an easy process to go through, but is one that we have to do in order to make sure that, we get to the right endpoints.
We've got a lot of political uncertainty on both sides of our border here at home. The kind of the waiting game about when the election might be. Is the prime minister going to stay or go? The U.S. situation, which is, fascinating in industry and interesting, but a bit of a gong show. It's kind of hard for anybody to be making decisions about anything, like where you might even make your damn travel plans, not knowing what it's going to be like, right? What does that do to this sector?
Well, I'd have to say this. It's not like the world hasn't seen tumult before. So, I'm always an optimist, Pam. I think
I know
that
you are.
pessimists are often right. Optimists are often wrong. But if anything good happens in the world, it's because an optimist tried to make a difference. And so for me, when I look at the world, are there challenges? Absolutely. I'm not blind to what's going on, whether it's in Ukraine or Gaza or within our own political borders, geopolitical borders in Canada or the United States. But I think that, I am optimistic that there's a pendulum that swings.
Yeah.
And, in politics, like Newton's second law, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So the current Canadian government's agenda, there's some pushback on the headlong hurtling into, some of the energy policies that, in my view, have demonstrated themselves not to work very well in places like Europe. And so there's some pushback on that. And that's a good thing. And through a democratic process, I have faith in the overall wisdom of Canadians that we'll find our way through this.
You've always been that way. This is every conversation I've ever had with you always ends that way. Yes, it's a nightmare, but we're gonna get through it. We're gonna fix it. We're gonna solve it. Thank God there are people like you in the world that just keep working away at it and trying to make the changes. Gary, great to talk with you again.
Thank you, Senator. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, we'll see you soon. Gary Mard, President and CEO of the Canada West Foundation, and this is a body that spends kind of 24/7, 365 working on those policy issues and trying to make the politicians in the country smarter. So thanks for that too.
Thank you, Senator.
Okay, we'll talk soon. That is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin, and we'll see you soon too as well.